Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurika Charibag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module Liberal Feminism and Radical Feminism. In this module, we will discuss the concept of gender, gender inequality and equality debates using the perspective of liberal and radical feminism. And while doing this, we will look into the histories, the tenets and the current articulations of both liberal and radical feminism. And the important keywords in this module include gender, feminism, radical feminism, liberal feminism, patriarchy and gender equality. Types of feminism. Based on their understanding of gender and gender inequality, various strands of feminist thought have developed over the years. However, it is to be noted that the categorization of these various feminism is more for analytical purposes, as often the strands drawn from one another rather than remain elusive. The first three major strands of feminism which were developed in the West were liberal feminism, Marxist and socialist feminism, and radical feminism. Liberal feminism's central argument is that there exists gender inequality which can be ended when women get the same rights as men through legal, political, educational and other reforms within the existing system. Socialist feminism argues that gender inequality stems mainly from inequalities set forth by capitalist system. Radical feminism takes as basis sexual politics as the basis of gender oppression. To combat the limitations posed by these forms of feminism, other strands began to evolve from these strands. Few of them include Black feminism, developed as a critique of the radical feminist view that women around the world share a common universal experience of oppression. According to Black feminist thinkers, gender oppression cannot be separated from race and class oppression and need to be analyzed at their intersections. Postmodern feminism, in adherence to postmodern thought, has argued that basic conceptual categories such as women and gender need to be challenged and deconstructed rather than taken for granted. There have been some common forms of feminist articulations. Liberal feminism. Liberal feminism holds the view that if a society is to achieve gender equality, then it must provide women with the same political rights and economic opportunities as well as the same education that men enjoy. For liberal feminists, the ideal sex and gender system would be the one where each individual can act as a free and responsible moral agent. Individuals may be free to choose the lifestyle most suitable to him or her without being judged for it, be it for a housewife or house husband, unmarried careerist, or a part of a dual income family, childless or with children, heterosexual or homosexual. This liberal feminist, the ideal sex gender system would be the one wherein each individual can act as a free and responsible moral agent. Individuals may be free to choose the lifestyle most suitable to him or her without being judged for it, be it for housewife or house husband, unmarried, careerist or a part of a dual income family, childless or with children, heterosexual or homosexual. This liberal feminist ideal is then consistent with the dominant American philosophical tradition of liberal democracy and capitalism, with its reformist orientation and its appeal to values of individualism, choice, responsibility, and equality of opportunity. Liberal feminist calls for the formation of a society in which each individual can act as a free and responsible agent and be able to live the life that is most suitable for him or herself. Liberal feminism's emphasis on freedom of choice and equality between sexes, while pushing for change, is more reformist in its agenda than revolutionary, as it does not question the basic roots of inequality and challenge the present sex-gender system itself. The fundamental tenets of liberal feminism can be summarized thus: all individuals have certain features, they are capable of achieving rationality, moral agency and self-realization. 2. These qualities can be exercised through legal recognition of universal rights. 3. The inequalities between sexes are not based on any natural differences but are consequences of socially constructed patterns of behavior. And finally, gender equality in society can be achieved through an organized appeal to human capacity to be moved by rational arguments. History of liberal feminism. Liberal feminism developed largely out of the liberal school of thought, and its origins are generally traced back to Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of Rights of the Woman, published in 1792, which argues that women should have the same opportunities as men in order to develop their full human potential. Wollstonecraft emphasized upon rationality as the distinctive feature of human beings and rejected the notion that women are inherently irrational, insisting that, given equal opportunities to education, women should also develop into rational beings. Nearly a century later, Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill took forward this work on rationality and equality. While Wollstonecraft primarily focused on equal access to education for both men and women, Taylor and Mill went further to argue for equal political and economic opportunities as well. Their work largely focused upon individual autonomy, economic and political educational opportunity, and equality for all humans. An important part of the politics was their demand for women's suffrage. They believed that the power to vote would not only allow women to express their own political views, but that it would also enable and facilitate change in the larger political systems and structures which are oppressive. Initially, the women's movement in USA was closely tied to the abolitionist movement. Several members of the suffrage movement were strong abolitionists and began organizing for women's rights while still members of these anti-slavery organizations. However, they soon realized that their male colleagues were reluctant to link the anti-slavery movement with the women's movement. At the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention, which many feminists attended, none of the women were allowed to speak. Incensed by this, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton broke away from the abolitionist movement and began organizing for women's rights to vote. This resulted in the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, when Stanton presented the Declaration of Sentiments. Their focus was to create a constitutional amendment for the women's right to vote, along with actively working on other issues such as changing inheritance and divorce laws and the women's economic inequality. Finally, in 1920, women were guaranteed the right to vote. Following a small period of lull in the women's movement, in 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. The book focused on the experiences of white, heterosexual, middle-class educated women who found traditional roles of wife and mother unsatisfying. She termed this the problem with no name. Friedan argued that they need to find more meaningful roles in full-time public work, but it is important to note that she did not demand a sacrifice of motherhood or marriage for a career. This idea became the background for the contemporary women's movement, which gave rise to modern liberal feminism. Women took to streets, gave speeches, lobbied politicians, and worked for legislative changes in areas such as education, employment, sexual harassment, healthcare, and politics, as well as for the end of inequality based on gender. Main tenets. Liberal feminists singled out various factors which contribute to inequalities between men and women and tried to bring about change. They focused on areas such as institutions of marriage, motherhood, and family, as well as work, education, and reproductive rights. They brought to light the central role marriage and family play in reinforcing gender norms and stereotypes in society. They critique the traditional nuclear family structure, which they claim is discriminatory towards women. By expecting women to be at home to take care of children and the elderly, and men to work outside the home to support the family, it set boundaries and limits choices for both the sexes. They also argued that women who do take up careers suffer additional burden of household labor along with maintaining successful jobs, as husbands continue to refrain from assisting their wives with household chores even when both of them are working. Thus, the traditional gender roles of women as caretakers and men as breadwinners continue to persist even when women enter the workforce. Since liberal feminists do not view women's oppression as a systemic problem, they attempt to combat it through making reformatory changes within the existing system. This is done through changes in the law, legislation, and litigation and other democratic means. Additionally, true to their liberal philosophical origins, they also believe that they can appeal to the human capacity for rational moral judgments. They call for equal opportunities in various spheres such as educational, economic, etc. They also advocated the elimination of sexist messages in family, education, and mass media. Liberal feminists have worked through legislative change to ensure equality of education and to bar job discrimination. For example, in the UK, they actively fought for legislation such as Equal Pay Act 1970 and the Sex Discrimination Act 1975 because they believed it essential for the women's rights movement that the law should recognize and propagate gender equality. Another important tenet of liberal feminism is the belief that all women have the right to privacy and the right to their own bodies. Historically speaking, the basis of marriage was primarily a way to procreate and extend the family line. It is only within the modern discourse that the marriage came to be seen as a means to having a relationship based on love and friendship. Thus, traditionally, wives were legally considered the property of their husbands with no rights of their own bodies. Control over pregnancy, abortion, birth control rested in the hands of the husbands or families rather than the women themselves. This became one of the rallying points for the women's liberation movement, who demanded complete autonomy for women to make their own decisions regarding their bodies. Thus, it can be seen that liberal feminism primarily works through the existing system to bring about reforms in a gradual manner. When compared to many radical feminists and Marxist feminists, they are more moderate in their aims and methods, as they do not call for an overthrow of the existing unequal structure. Critics. One of the main critiques of liberal feminism is that its demands have been classist and racist. For example, while liberal feminists actively participated in pro-abortion campaigns, they failed to recognize how women of color and women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds often struggle for the right to keep and realize their fertility, because these women historically face the problems of forced sterilization, medical experimentation, and so on from the US government. In addition to racism and classism, liberal feminism has also been accused of being heterosexist, especially by radical feminists and lesbian feminists. When lesbians working with the women's liberation movement decided publicly to declare their sexual identity, the leadership and membership of organizations such as the National Organization for Women were hesitant to support them, as they felt that a vocal and visible lesbian constituency may cause damage to the women's movement. Another area where liberal feminism has faced strong backlash is for the notion of women as superwomen, capable of successfully combining marriage, family, and career. This was eventually considered by critics as more oppressive towards women, as they were now expected to succeed in a male-dominated workplace while simultaneously managing the traditional roles of ideal housewives and mothers. Lastly, liberal feminism has been severely criticized for its failure to recognize the systemic nature of gender inequality in society. By focusing only on independent factors of gender inequality which women face, sexism, discrimination, sexual harassment, and unequal pay, liberal feminists do not grasp the entirety of the problem and thus only extend a partial analysis. It fails to seek challenge existing social system because it seeks entry into these institutions rather than seeking to eliminate or change them. Radical feminism. The basic argument of radical feminism is that men are responsible for and benefit from the exploitation of women. The analysis of patriarchy, the systemic domination of women by men, is one of the central concerns to this branch of feminism. Patriarchy is perceived to be a universal phenomenon, and that has existed transhistorically and transculturally. Within the system, men learn how to hold women in contempt and to see them as non-human and to control them. Radical feminists see in every social arrangement, be it class, caste, race, or ethnicity, the workings of patriarchy. The entire politics is based on challenging and eliminating the patriarchal system. The basis of radical feminism is their analysis of the interlinkages between sex and power. While sex has always been discussed, either overtly or covertly, it was not until radical feminism bold declaration that the personal is political that the woman's sexuality became a subject of much political analysis. The main tenets of radical feminism can be summarized thus: that women were historically the first oppressed group, women's oppression is the most widespread, existing nearly in every society. Women's oppression is the deepest and the hardest form of oppression to eradicate and cannot be removed by other social changes such as abolition of class society. History. Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex in 1949 in France reopened the subject of sex and power to feminist analysis. It was followed by Betty Friedan's Feminine Mistake in 1963 in America, which heralded the second wave of organized feminism. At this time, a group of women who were discontent with the subordinate position within the New Left soon formed the Women's Liberation Movement, which eventually split into two groups based on the differing political leanings, the liberal feminist and the radical feminist. Dissatisfied by the political demands of the liberal feminists by the late 1960s, small groups of women began meeting regularly to discuss the effects of male supremacy, not only in the spheres of women's profession, education, and public life, but more importantly in their private lives as well. These early discussions, which soon evolved into a technique called consciousness raising, led to these women sharing and speaking about the everyday violence that each suffered and of the sexual shames and terrors that they all had carried throughout their lives. However, the purpose of these discussions was not simply to find some personal solution to these problems. However, these discussions were held in order to understand the social basis of the problem, including the sexual, and then do something to change it for everyone. As emphasized in the article, The Personal is Political by Carol Hanisch, consciousness raising was not therapy. On the contrary, it was envisaged as a political tool modeled on the Chinese practice called speaking bitterness. Its purpose was to challenge the accepted notions about women which had been built by men, since traditionally they were also the so-called experts on women and gained from perpetuating certain ideas about them. Thus, in order to truly understand the situation of women, radical feminists sought to base their analysis on the information they could trust, and for this they decided to gather it themselves. They began to question all sweeping statements that had been made in the past about women and the question and the interests they served, and began to substitute these with their own experiences of being women. What did these consciousness-raising discussions lead to? It led to sexual politics being recognized as a public issue. For the first time, it so clearly brought together the private and the public, the personal and the political. One of the most important ideas espoused by the radical feminists was, in fact, the personal is political. What exactly is meant by this? By this, they meant that women's private experiences of oppression, that is, domestic violence, discrimination within the family, are not isolated instances of oppression, but a part of a larger system of institutional inequality. Through the consciousness-raising groups, issues such as rape, abortion, domestic abuse, sexuality, which were previously considered individual personal problems, became politicized issues for feminist movement. While the physical and sexual violence against women were obvious forms of oppression, radical feminism highlighted the complex and covert forms of oppression seen in the exacting standards of beauty and fashion, in the control of reproductive rights, in the oppressive ideals of motherhood, ideals of chastity and purity, heteronormativity, sexual harassment in the workplace, gynecological practices, unpaid labor, domestic violence, pornography, and so on. Due to their stance that sexuality is the principal basis of male power in which uneven gender relations are constructed, a major part of the radical feminist discourse was their objection to pornography. They claim that pornography systematically objectifies women and dehumanizes them, thereby making them more susceptible to violence. American scholar Andrea Dworkin and lawyer Catherine McKinnon worked to introduce anti-pornography legislation in the US and defined pornography as a graphic, sexually explicit subordination of women shown as filthy, inferior, bleeding, bruised, or hurt in a context that makes these conditions sexual. When faced with the objection that people can separate virtual reality from reality, radical feminists argue that pornography often functions in the same way that advertising does. Although there is no law stating that women need to look like supermodels they see on television, there is a standard of beauty being created which they feel pressure to live up to. In much the same way, they argue that pornography creates an ideal for sexually acceptable behavior which is discriminatory towards women. While there were some differences within the radical feminists with regard to the nature of patriarchy, what they all agreed upon was the fact that patriarchy was established and maintained through the use of violence, rape, sexual abuse, prostitution, sadistic pornography, female infanticide, sati, and so on. Since men have the advantage of physical force, they use it to establish control over women. This, according to radical feminists, is a reason for almost universal existence of patriarchy. Men create and maintain patriarchy not only because they have the means to do so, but because in doing so serves their own interest in multiple ways. Women are exceptionally effective means of satisfying male desire, and their bodies are essential to the production of children who satisfy both practical and neurotic needs for women. Moreover, women make invaluable labor force, one which comes without a cost. Further, they are also looked upon as ornamental signs of male status and power. The fact that they make great companions to both child and adult male, that they are pleasing partners, sources of emotional support, and importantly that the inferior position reinforces the male sense of central social significance, makes certain that men everywhere benefit from keeping them compliant. Radical feminists demand an overthrow of the system of patriarchy rather than demanding reformatory changes within the system. They believe that this can happen through a basic consciousness raising among women, which will lead to each womanhood recognizing her own value and strength, thereby rejecting patriarchal ideals of womanhood, submissive, dependent, and chaste, and instead establishing ties with other women, strengthening sisterhood of trust, support, appreciation. Once such sisterhood is established, it will make it easier for women to confront any aspect of patriarchy that they come across. Furthermore, they encourage a level of separatism, with women withdrawing into women-run business, households, communities, and so on. Lesbian feminism, a strand of feminism which grew out of radical feminism, contends that erotic political commitment to women is essential for the battle against patriarchy. Critics. Just as a case of liberal feminism, one of the main criticisms that radical feminism has faced that it has tended to ignore the role of class, race, ethnicity in maintaining and reinforcing the capitalist system. By believing that other political issues such as class and race were secondary to the political goals, radical feminist movement was overwhelmingly white and middle class. In other words, it saw women as an undifferentiated homogeneous category rather than a heterogeneous category separated by race, class, and ethnicity. Radical feminist theory does not adequately address structural oppression, nor does it take into account an intersectional approach to understanding women's experiences. While structural oppression theories focus on the structures of patriarchy, capitalism, racism, heterosexism, and the way they mutually support one another in order to be dominant forces. Intersectionality theories contend that while all women experience oppression, they are differentially oppressed on the basis of not only their gender but also caste, class, race, sexual preference, and so on. The inadequacy of the radical feminist framework to take into account of such issues led to the development of separate strands of feminism such as socialist feminism, black feminism. Radical feminism is also criticized for focusing exclusively on patriarchy without adequately explaining it. In this module on liberal feminism and radical feminism, we looked at the history of modern feminist movement. We also looked at liberal feminism, especially how they believe in institutional changes, and then the critique of liberal feminists through the radical feminists, where they argue that personal is political. Further, we also dealt with how both liberal feminists and radical feminists dealt with issues of patriarchy and gender inequality. Further, we came to a conclusion that largely we cannot understand feminism as feminism, but rather as feminisms.